welcome to The Opinion, the talk show where your opinions matter. I am Mirna Santiago, and joining me as always is my co-host Adeline Ortiz, and our guest today, professor and former assistant district attorney, Marco Caviglia.
Today we're discussing drunk driving laws in New York State, specifically whether the penalties are too harsh or too lenient. Of most concern is a law that was passed in 2010 requiring that those convicted of a drunk driving offense install an ignition interlocking device on their vehicles. This device must be installed and maintained at the driver's expense. And Marco can tell us a little bit more about his experience with respect to handling these types of cases.
Well, the DWI laws have gotten extremely punitive, especially in the last several years. First and foremost, while prosecution is pending, you will have your license suspended no matter how long it takes. Also, as you've mentioned, there's the ignition interlocking device that has to be installed on all the vehicles to which you have access. That means your wife's, your son's, and so forth as well. Monetarily, the fines are enormous. Just on a first-time DWI misdemeanor, it's a $1,000 fine, $370 for a surcharge, $275 for the DMV assessment amount. Wow. Your license is then, after the fact, revoked for 1 year. And last but not least, your auto registration might even be revoked. So it's pretty punitive, even for a first-time offender.
Sure. Good stuff.
Thank you, Marco, for explaining that to us. You know, and I understand that drunk driving, I don't think any of us here are saying that drunk driving is something that the legislature should be lenient on. But at the same time, I feel that the legislature is taking a sort of one-size-fits-all approach to drunk driving, where whether you're a first-time offender or serial habitual drunk, you know, and driver, that they're going to impose these enormous penalties. I'm particularly concerned about someone who works, for instance, and is especially up here in Putnam County, where we don't have readily available public transportation, that someone should lose their license pending prosecution, because to me that's implying that you're guilty until you're proven innocent, where our criminal system in the United States is you're innocent until you're proven guilty. You know, Adeline, what are your thoughts?
Well, you know, I definitely think that sometimes the government can go a little bit too far, and I'm certainly not comfortable with the discretion resting in law enforcement officers during some routine stop. However, I do believe that the legislative goals are broader than just preventing drunken driving. This is a really serious issue. I mean, there are deaths that result. There are disabilities that come of it. I mean, what about those people who are maimed during an accident, who can no longer work, provide for their families, who are completely now dependent, if they don't have resources of their own, on government support to take care of them for the balance of their lives, and as well as a number of people connected with them. There's also a psychological and emotional fallout for family members of victims who die in drunk driving accidents. There's counseling, there's therapy needs, there are all types of implications. And I can say that, having worked in the insurance industry for several years, there's also a financial impact to drunk driving. Right now, I believe that men under the age of 30 who are single are probably in the highest risk category for insurance premiums, and that includes the kids still living at home with mom and dad. So here's some incentive for moms and dads to get those boys out, okay? Get them on their own so they can pay their own insurance premiums.
Well, Marco, I'm curious to hear what you have to say about this. You know, sort of based on what Adeline is saying, she seems to be saying that the laws are too lenient, since that's sort of the debate, whether the drunk driving laws are too harsh or too lenient. I think they're too harsh. I still think they're too harsh, and I'm going to address the insurance issues in a minute. But Marco, I want to hear what you have to say on that.
Well, first of all, one of the things about the suspension pending prosecution is that it really deprives the defendant of a valuable property right. People need their licenses to drive to work, and that's where it really hurts. I remember fighting this in the lower courts when they passed that law, and I initially got it ruled to be unconstitutional, but ultimately the Court of Appeals disagreed and said it was constitutional. With regard to the insurance premiums, we have to understand that insurance is really socialized risk-taking, where we spread the risk around and we add a profit on top of that for the insurance industry. It's not illogical that the premiums for people that are considered targets having higher risk for DWI are charged more proportionately. So that doesn't really surprise me. But I think the important thing is that there comes a point in time where the harsher you make the penalties doesn't give you the same payback that you expect. So it's the law of diminishing returns. By constantly increasing the penalties, it does not make us safer on the roads, and it does not necessarily reduce the number of drunk drivers.
Well, for me, it seems that the purpose of the drunk driving laws and this sort of dual track that they have with respect to DMV and also the criminal courts and all the fines that they impose, it seems to me, at least, that it's being used to pad the coffers of the state and the DMV. I don't see the interest. I don't see the prevailing interest in making sure that drunk drivers get off the road. If that was the case, then if you get arrested for drunk driving, if there's an issue with the drunk driving, why not make you use that money, that $500 or $1,000, and you have to pay for a treatment facility for yourself, an alcohol treatment facility or rehabilitation facility. That way you understand what the impact is of your actions as a drunk driver or as a driver under the influence. Instead, they hit you over the head with all these fines. So basically, it just shows that the bottom line is about getting more money in. And with respect to the insurance industry, as you know, I also worked for several years in the insurance industry, and after 8 years in the insurance industry, I am well aware that the insurance company never loses any money. No matter what the economy is like. I know when I was there, they would say, oh, the market is soft right now, we're losing money. At the same time that they were saying the market was soft, they were making billions in record profits. They posted their most profits ever. And you know why that is? Because at least for the insurance company that I worked for, they even had a saying that said, remember the 90%. Only 10% of all people ever submit claims. So they're retaining the benefit of 90% of those premiums. And with this case, I think we talked a little bit about it last time, Adeline, about if you have a company, a business like the insurance company that makes record profits, that makes a lot of money, they also have a lot of lobbying power. So I could bet you that the insurance company was behind this sort of dual track system with the fines and what have you, because what the insurance company got out of it is that now when you get pulled over for drunk driving and alcohol shows in your blood regardless of the level, the insurance company can now deny you first party coverage. So you don't get the benefit of your premium. If you get hurt in an accident or if your car gets damaged, the insurance company can deny you coverage for that simply because you had a drink or two, which I don't think that's fair.
Well, that's again private sector versus government control, and I think that unfortunately drunk driving is becoming big business for the insurance industry, and it's sad. But why shouldn't somebody profit from somebody else's reckless, unreasonable, irrational behavior? The reality is that if you are concerned about losing your license, if you're concerned about fines and penalties and all of the consequences that come with driving while under the influence, then don't drink and drive. Okay, don't drink and drive. For the most part, New York has a lot of major cities, and especially New York City, where it appears to be a huge issue. And there are lots of ways to commute in New York City. You have carpool, trains, buses, you walk, ride a bicycle, do whatever you have to do, but don't drink and drive. Don't allow your children to drink and drive, because the fact that this reckless behavior results in even one death for some innocent party is horribly unfair to that person. So really, who cares about the victim of drunken driving being the actual person who engaged in this behavior? For me, I'm not entirely concerned about that person.
But we as a society have an interest in making sure our laws don't become too draconian. That's why we don't cut people's hands off for stealing in this country. It's the same thing with the drinking and driving. Like I said, if the interest is in making sure that you get those drunk drivers off the road, give them an alcohol education class. Show them those accidents where people are hurt and injured. Show them what the process is. This is what happens when you drink and drive. Do not hit them over the head with $1,000. I mean, we are in lean economic times. You're telling somebody we're going to take away your license So now you can't go to work, but we're going to charge you $1,000 for this, $500 for this. You need an interlock ignition device, or and I'm saying it wrong, but we're going to put that on your car, and you have to pay $30, I think it is, a month to maintain that. That's going into somebody else's pocket.
Well, poor baby. Okay, I'm sorry, but the bottom line is that in our society we have many rights that protect individuals, and the bottom line is that you can't even be pulled over on the road unless there's probable cause or some reasonable suspicion that you're engaging in some improper behavior. And if your refusal at that point to take a breathalyzer test results in the suspension of your license or some fines being imposed, well then so be it, okay? Because I think that the combination between the probable cause, the reasonable suspicion, whatever the basis was for that stop, combined with the fact that you refused to take a breathalyzer test, should result in some consequence to you, because as far as I'm concerned, there's an indication of wrongdoing. Marco, you look like you're about to disagree with me.
Well, no, not necessarily. But first of all, there's no doubt that the DWI enforcement industry has a money-making proposition. I mean, everybody's making money off of this thing, and it's not necessarily the lawyers. There's a lot of costs involved, there's a lot of jobs that are created, and it's an ongoing enterprise now. One of the things that bothers me is that certain organizations like Mothers Against Drunk Driving actually get a portion of those public funds that are taken so that they can further their lobbying efforts for harsher and harsher penalties. So it's a self-perpetuating mechanism. I do want to point out that if you refuse to take the roadside Alka-Sensor test, you'll get a ticket for that, but you won't lose your license. It's only the chemical test at the police station that, when you refuse, will result in the revocation of your license. And another thing that should be understood is that that revocation will go on regardless of whether or not you are acquitted of the DWI charge or if it's dismissed. So you still have that civil penalty, which means no license, even if you beat the criminal charge. With regard to roadside stops and so forth, yes, the police have vast discretion in pulling you over, and it's just retroactively, if and when you get to a court of law, that there's a close look at why the officer stopped you. But by and large, police have tremendous discretion, and they exercise it every single day.
And I think that that's, again, a reason to be concerned, because if they can pull you over for just about anything, and now you're kind of on this slippery slope where everything you do from here on in is going to be subjected to a fine or a penalty or a revocation, then again, it goes to where the laws are becoming a little too strict, a little too harsh, a little too draconian, and we have to protect people and put out that we need to educate people and not so much punish them. Marco, I know you do some DWI defense, so are there any tips that you can tell our watchers about what to do if or when you're pulled over?
Well, basically, if you pull over, you're typically asked where you're coming from and going to. You can answer that question, but actually you can refuse to answer any questions. People don't realize that. You have the right to silence from the beginning. You have to produce your license and registration, but you're giving information to the police officers is actually discretionary with you, but everybody does. But the last thing you want to say is that, well, I'm coming from a bar and I've only had a couple, because you'll be out doing the Irish jig called the field sobriety test in no time. So that's one of the things. You do have a right not to take the sobriety tests. People don't realize they have that right. In fact, you can be non-cooperative, but I always suggest that you can always be polite with a police officer.
Mm-hmm. Well, you said you have a right to silence, and I wonder actually whether that's even true. And I think post 9/11, that right to silence is growing smaller and smaller every day, because it's something that's actually not even triggered until you're taken into some form of custody. Okay, and so technically, you don't really have a right to silence. Sure, you can refuse to cooperate with the police, but as you mentioned, that doesn't serve you well. I will not disagree that law enforcement could certainly benefit from training and not be given so much power and broad discretion in these matters. However, I still think that the penalties should remain harsh for people who choose to drive under the influence. It's a choice that you make when you leave your home sober and you decide to engage in reckless behavior and then go ahead and get behind the wheel of your vehicle and, you know, risk other people's lives. Absolutely, you should be punished when you behave recklessly and when you endanger other people in society. And with respect to a portion of the funds going to the MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving organization, I think that's fantastic. I mean, there's no greater victim in all of this than a mother who has lost a child in a drunk driving incident.
I don't think they have a place in the legislative scheme. I don't think that one particular group, I mean, I'm sure there's hundreds of groups that are dedicated to keeping drunk drivers off the road. You know, well, what about Sisters Against Drunk Drivers? What about, you know, Wives Against Drunk Drivers? I don't think that Mothers Against Drunk Drivers should necessarily benefit from having these harsh penalties, from having these fines, because it behooves them to have them, because they're getting funneled to them. You know, again, you sort of have that blurry line where things become, you know, too draconian. When you have a blurry line now between, okay, what is a proper penalty for this offense? If what we're trying to do is to keep drunk drivers off the road, are we trying to keep drunk drivers off the road, or are we trying to make sure that MAD has money so that they can run their operation?
Why shouldn't they? Why shouldn't they? How many other powerful organizations have billions of dollars and unlimited amounts of money to influence Congress and legislators? I mean, what about the pharmaceutical companies? I mean, come on, really?
Well, we talked a little
why
bit about
shouldn't
insurance,
why shouldn't an organization that's dedicated to a good and worthy cause by a group of individuals who've probably suffered the greatest loss of all, benefiting from having a portion of these funds given to their organization so that they can lobby legislation in the direction that they want it to go to? Why not?
Margaret's trying to jump in there.
But fine money should never be used to pay for a lobbying group. I mean, you want to contribute money to a lobbying group, that's your business, and you can join a super PAC for that matter. But I don't think fine money that's imposed on people who often can't afford it. These are working people, most of them. They're not, you know, Lohan or whatever. And you know, so it's a real burden. But where the money goes, I think, is the fact that makes it objectionable.
And I think also you're picking and choosing where you're going to enforce. You know, sure, the drunk drivers are unpopular. You know, like you said, you're engaging in reckless behavior. You shouldn't be drinking and driving. But what about other behavior? In fact, when you look at the statistics, speeding accidents are actually the leading cause of death and injuries on the road, not drunk drivers. Speeding. Are you going to tell me that you've never gone past the speed limit?
Never.
Yeah.
Never.
Of course not. So, you know, today it's drunk drivers. Tomorrow it could be you. You know, there could be some other lobbying group out there, you know, people against speeders that are now going to come after you and impose fines and that sort of thing.
Well, then I'll start my own lobbying effort. There's just no way.
There has to be a fine line, and I think that fine line has been passed with respect to these, you know, these fines that are imposed against drunk drivers.
Yeah, one thing I'd like to say is that current studies have shown that the increasing penalties, getting harsher and harsher, have had almost no effect on recidivism or avoiding first-time offenders. In other words, we've gotten well past the point where these fines and penalties are going to do it. Just adding stricter and stricter penalties so that if you caught, you basically are destroyed, doesn't have the deterrent effect that a lot of people think. So we're unnecessarily harsh for it. And you know, my experience over 33 years of representing DWI cases has shown me that most people arrested the very first time, regardless of outcome, don't come back. So I think that's something that the general public may miss and should be pointed out.
What's the typical age group, I mean, that we're dealing with here? I mean, who are the biggest offenders that you've seen in your personal experience in representing these types of cases?
Well, probably on the younger end, and by that I mean people up to their 40s.
That's young. Thank you.
Yeah,
Well, everything's relative. But I mean, you rarely see people in their 50s and 60s, although it does happen on occasion. So it's younger people. It's usually linked into their social life. If drinking or imbibing is part of your social life, then it's going to be much more common. In a place like Putnam County, and this goes back to something one of you raised, we're not a metropolitan area. You can't get on the subway. There's not a bar locally that you walk to. Here you're forced to drive, and sometimes you go out socializing. You don't intend on becoming intoxicated, but you'll have a drink socially. But if you overdo it, the next problem is how to get home. You can't take the bus. Sometimes cabs don't run to certain places that late or forever. And sometimes you can't wait an hour at 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. So you say, well, I'm not that bad, and you might drive. So a lot of, quote, normal people, unfortunately sometimes drink and drive. And that doesn't mean it's not careless and bad planning, but it's just a fact of life. And we really shouldn't destroy people who are caught. We should, as someone said, try to improve them. There is a thing called the Victim Impact Program, and everybody convicted is required to take it. And this is a one-night session in which victims of DWI, families or the actual victim, discusses what they went through. And you're required to take it. And this Victim Impact Program is designed to let that drunk driver see what he or she has done. Also, when you try to get a conditional license, you are evaluated by a counselor to see if you have a drinking problem, and they can order as a condition of your getting your license reinstated that you undergo counseling for drinking.
Great. Well, it looks like we're out of time for our drunk driving segment, but as always, we do have our lightning round discussion. And today's question is, should churches continue to be tax exempt in these lean economic times? As you guys both know, churches first received tax exempt status in 1894. And since then, every single state and the District of Columbia have now agreed to exempt churches from paying property and income. Well, it's not considered income because it's donations to the church, but they don't pay taxes on any of that. So, Adeline, let's start with you. What are your thoughts on whether churches should be taxed?
Tax the churches. That's my short answer. Tax the churches, okay? My mother is not going to be happy to hear me say this because I was raised Catholic, and of course, hopefully God doesn't take this lightning round too literally and strike me dead for saying this. But okay, tax the churches. I'm a spiritual person, but not necessarily having bought into the religion and religious component of church. And I think that at the end of the day, they are a business like anyone else, and they certainly have a lot of money. I've been to the Vatican. They have money. The Catholic Church has money, okay? And I'm sure many other religious organizations out there as well have a good deal of money. I don't see any reason, particularly during these harsh economic times, that religious organizations shouldn't also be contributing to the tax funds. Absolutely, tax them.
Marco.
Well, let's not pick on the Catholic Church. I mean, the richest church in the United States, for example, is the Salvation Army.
Really?
And everybody likes the Salvation Army because they're seen as doing good for the public directly all the time. I think historically, churches wound up getting a benefit from taxation because before government got involved, it was the churches and the clergy that took care of the poor and the helpless. However, I think everybody will agree that we've migrated as a government where we've assumed a lot of those things, in part becoming more of a welfare state in which we help those that we consider poor or needy. And now what's happened is that the justification of why certain institutions like the church should not be taxed has largely evaporated. And of great significance is the impact that the lack of property taxes on places that have lots of these institutions, 501c3 organizations, which are tax exempt, as well as exempt from property, is that municipalities have a tremendously shrinking tax base. So property owners who own houses and so forth are really getting hammered by taxes. So there's a lot of good reasons to reassess whether churches and perhaps other not-for-profit institutions should really be tax exempt.
Well, I have to say that one of the reasons that churches were tax exempt is because of that whole separation of church and state. And I know that one of the caveats, if you will, for them being tax exempt is that they stay out of politics. But we're kind of seeing, again, that line blurred in a lot of these cases where you have the Mormon church and they were supporting Prop 8 out in California. You have a lot of churches speaking out against abortion. You have a lot of churches, talking about all of these other things, defunding for Planned Parenthood. Just a ton of different things that shows the churches, there is no separation anymore between church and state. A lot of these churches are really injecting themselves into politics. So the government really needs to take a look at whether the benefit of giving these churches these tax benefits, it's still benefiting the government, it's still benefiting the people. As you say, the government is providing a lot of these services that the churches typically provided. Now, you mentioned the Salvation Army. Did you know that the Church of Scientology actually earns $500 million in tax-free income a year? $500 million. And then you have a lot of these mega churches. I think the pastor that you like, actually, Joel Osteen, he makes $50 million a year in donations from his parishioners. A lot of these mega churches do. And I think it's unfair that they're getting this amount of money when everybody else is suffering, when the government is suffering. And they really do need to be taxed on the income that they're making from their parishioners, who are contributing 10% of their income. Imagine if I got 10% of everybody's income.
Oh my goodness. I think we can convince our audience to contribute 10% of their salary. So the Church of Mirna and Adeline.
Why not? And that's really
sounds like a great business to be into.
There you go. And that's really all you need is just, send something in saying you're a church, we're tax exempt, and that's it. Let's go for it.
Absolutely. I think that we really need to define what it means to be a church, too. I mean, again, traditionally, the church was supposed to be something that was religion, that had a spiritual component, that actually helped the community in some way. I don't know a single church that you could walk into and ask for clothing and food.
Yeah,
I haven't seen any churches distributing, food or clothing or providing shelter. They absolutely don't do that anymore. I mean, all of that has fallen on government, when the churches clearly have the power and the ability to truly help their parishioners, beyond a spiritual fill, so to speak. And they're really not doing that anymore. So why continue to allow them to benefit?
We're unanimous.
Absolutely. There we go. We agree. So that's it. Okay.
Well, folks, that is all the time that we have for the episode of The Opinion today. But join us the next time, where we're going to be talking about domestic violence and whether the laws that are on the books now are sufficient to assist those victims of domestic violence. So thank you so much, Marco, for joining us.
My pleasure.
And Adeline, as always.